So, wait a minute. Yeah. So if you take a look on 737 with me for just a moment, again, over to 738, I always read this as Hegel's, where he's saying things like the concept is everything, the concept is all, and the method is therefore to be acknowledged as the unrestrictedly universal internal external mode, and as the absolutely infinite force. So all that kind of language that he uses in the middle paragraph on 737. I've found myself eventually reading that as a kind of epistemological moment in this massively ontological text, right? This is Hegel saying, look, this thing is how you know everything in its truth. So if you want to know it's in its truth, it's because it's the nature of all reality. So the ontology, sorry, do it the reverse. The epistemology flows from the ontology, right? Because the concept has been shown to be this, then and only then can we say we can know things in their truth when we know them in accordance with it. So the method here is at that point a method of knowledge, right? It's a way in which we know things, a way in which we've come to grasp and come conceptualize things themselves. So I've grown to read that as an epistemological moment, one of the few in this text. And then Hegel on 738 and following, when he starts to walk you through the three moments of the method, reverts back now not to knowing stuff, but really to talk about it in its ontological valence, its ontological vector. So he's just been talking about this epistemological, how do you know things? The concept is the truth, so it's how you know everything is through the concept. And nothing can resist the concept, right? That's that language. So that means if you want to know something, you got to know it in the concept. This is the same parallel in the logic to what he's been saying about the business of philosophy is to know one thing only, the idea. Is absolutely perfect. But then he starts walking you through what he calls the movement of the concept, right? And this is the method. And it's, let's admit, very odd to call this a method because there's no, to use Descartes' line, no rules for the direction of the human mind. Okay? You don't get a roadmap here for, okay, once you've got your subject matter before you, here's the following 5 things you do to investigate, understand, and distill it into its essential components. None of that. Right? What you have here is simply, well, we have a beginning. That leads necessarily to progress. And that progress necessarily ends up in a totality known as a system. That's the method, right? And that's not a recipe. That's not a step-by-step plan for how you go about investigating anything at all. But of course, he's just told you that to know anything in its truth is to know it in accordance with the movement of the concept. So what he's doing here is distilling at its most basic level what that movement is. What that movement is. So he tells us it begins with a beginning. 738, 239 in the German, under 1. Accordingly, what constitutes the method are the determinations of the concept. So our method is not something different than this. It is precisely this, the movement of the concept, and their connections, their relations. And these we must now examine in the significance that they have as determinations of the method. So now we've been talking about them, of course, all along in the book. But now we're going to look at them just on their own. So let's look at the first one, beginning. He calls this beginning because it's about immediacy. He says, this is on page 739. This is the first full paragraph down. The beginning, therefore, has for the method. Everybody see where I'm at? He says, the beginning, therefore, has for the method no other determinateness than that of being simple and universal. So it's not yet mediated, simple, and it's universal. It is everything. This is precisely the determinateness that makes it deficient. It's a weird thing to say, right? Because it's simple and universal, it's deficient. Deficient how? Look what he says. Universality is the pure simple concept, and the method, as consciousness of the concept, is aware that universality is only a moment, and that in it the concept is still not determined in and for itself. So it's not yet complete into itself. So there's its deficiency. In other words, there's negativity already born within simple universality, because universality isn't yet particularized. It's abstract. But with this consciousness that would want to carry the beginning further only for the sake of method, the method would be or is only a formal affair posited in external reflection. So if we just go, hey, we got to start moving here. We know this can't be like this. We got to transform it. That would be an external methodology, not an immanent method. So what do you have to do? You have to stay with what it does. We've done this. We've fought this fight many times in the logic, right? Where we said, well, we know where this is going. We can read ahead. We know how things, are going to pan out, so we can go ahead and get there. Hegel says, no, patience. Patience, you haven't earned that. Let's slow down and see how this actually entails that. Or doesn't. He says, but with this consciousness that would want to carry the beginning further only for the sake of method, the method would be or is only a formal affair, posited in external reflection. Where the method, however, is the objective and immanent form, which is what we're trying to do. The immediacy of this beginning must be a deficiency inherent in the beginning itself. That can't be something that, oh, I don't like where it is. Oh, it's not got enough determination for the job I want it to do. That's all extrinsic constraints or extrinsic interests. It's got to be deficient unto itself. In other words, the negativity can't be our negativity that we brought to it. It's got to be the negativity that's inhabiting it itself already. Which must be endowed with the urge, trieb, to carry itself further. So what I love about this is that you have lack or deficiency here. The negativity is not a negativity that's a matter of conscious judgment about where something is and whether it fulfills or doesn't fulfill some role. Which, by the way, it had been, you can argue, it had been in the phenomenology. That's the way negativity works in the phenomenology. But here, it's the negativity born within concepts themselves, in beginnings themselves. Whether that beginning is being, or that beginning is essence, the beginning is the concept. All the sub-beginnings that you can talk about from there. He says, but in the absolute method, the universal has the value not of a mere abstraction, but of the objective universal. Objective universal is the universal that particularizes itself, that concretizes itself. That is, the universal that is in itself the concrete totality, but a totality as yet not posited, not yet for itself. Even the abstract universal is as such when considered conceptually, that is, in its truth, so there's that locution again, in its truth, not just something simple, but as an abstract, already posited, afflicted by a negation. Not by the negation we foisted upon it, but by the negation that's inherent within it. So determinate negation is not a work of consciousness. Determinate negation is a feature of being itself. Then look at what he says on 740. This is 241 in the German. And over time, I've grown to really love this passage because it works for a lot of things I want to claim about what Hegel's doing, but also it really kind of speaks to a kind of, I think, an assumption we often operate with when we're reading Hegel. And that is roughly this idea that, well, everything's there in the beginning. Right? The end is there in the beginning. Right? The oak tree is there in the acorn. It's already there, and we're just waiting to see it unfold. So this what looks like negativity, really not negativity. It's so full of what it's going to be that it drives itself to that new position. But look at what Hegel says. So he's talking about negation. Negation is what creates the advance, which is the next moment, right, of the concept, of the movement of the concept, and therefore the methodology. He says, though, this is at the end of the paragraph that comes over from 739, so 241, 740, this is about 2, 3, 4. Yeah, the advance is not, therefore, everybody see where I'm at? The advance is not, therefore, a kind of superfluidity. The advance is not a matter, right, of something welling up within the beginning and overflowing it, as though it's too much to be born within that first moment. It wants to expand. He says it's not like that. What is it? This is what it would be if that which is at the beginning were already the absolute. Now, I take that to mean that the end is not in the beginning. The beginning is not already the absolute, waiting to burst forth. The advance consists rather in this, that the universal determines itself. How does it do that? Through negation. He's already told you that's what's going on. It's already lacking in a certain way, and that's what provokes it to move beyond itself. That determinate negation is what does. The advance consists rather in this, that the universal determines itself and is the universal for itself, that is, equally a singular and a subject. Only in its consummation is it the absolute. It doesn't get there before it gets there. It's not always already there, hiding, waiting, buried, about to come out from. No. This is about as straightforward as Hegel can be about this, right? The end is not in the beginning and guiding from the start. What we would standardly call final causality. It's not what's happening. What's in the beginning is simple universality, that by virtue of its simpleness and nothing else is inadequate to itself. And therefore, it's already infected with negation. And that negation engenders its own transformation. There's the advance that comes from it itself. So progression or advance, the second moment, on the bottom of 740, the concept, the concrete totality that makes the beginning possesses as such within it the beginning of the advance and development. As concrete, it is differentiated in itself, but because of its initial immediacy, this first differentiation is to start with a diversity. So now he begins to walk through this, right? How does this negation of itself work? Well, initially it others itself into diversity. And then what does it do? It works out so that it has an analytic moment, a synthetic moment, very things we were seeing with cognition. It proves itself to be, as he says, an other. There's the synthetic moment. He calls that now on 741, first full paragraph down on 741, but it's way below the middle of the page. He calls that the dialectical moment. The dialectical moment. So, strictly speaking, and I'm not, trying to enforce dogmas here, but strictly speaking, the movement of the concept has a dialectical moment, but it's not itself the dialectic. The movement of the concept starts with pure, simple universality, which of itself necessarily others itself. And because it others itself, it's dialectical. So it has a dialectical moment to it. But the dialectic isn't, strictly speaking, equatable with the whole thing. It's just that moment. That's the way Hegel at least puts it here. He says, sort of standard, once he's invoked dialectic, Hegel says, okay, right? Plato. We all know this. Plato uses dialectic. It's an art there. The way of weaving things together. We know the Sophists, we know the Theaetetus and other late dialogues where Plato is talking about dialectic as an art practiced by the philosopher when they weave things together, right? Same and other, and all these oppositions. He says, it's often been regarded as an art as a subjective talent, and as though it did not belong to the objectivity of the concept. You know where Hegel's going to go with this, right? For me, it's not that. For me, it's the nature of reality itself. So the dialectic is not an art that we bring to nature and reality. It's what reality is in and of itself already. So, as he talks about here, this is on page 742, the Eleatics talk about the non-existence of things. They exploit this negativity of all things. Skeptics exploit this negativity of all things. But obviously, what they think is that this is something you can use, it's an art that you can use to undermine that either the realm of becoming and say everything is one, only being, the Eleatic movement, or that nothing actually is, skeptics movement. Hegel's saying to both of them, you've underestimated what dialectic is. Dialectic is not an art of subjective practice. Dialectic is the nature of reality. It's an objective thing, not a subjective practice. But that means then that it has this generative capacity. Well, here's where they've also underestimated it. Dialectic is not a subjective art form that we practice on things to show that they are not ultimately true. So it's a skeptic's move, a skeptical move within the Eleatics to show that everything is ultimately one and permanent. It's not that. It actually is generative itself. That negation is productive. Hegel takes himself at this point to have shown that negation is productive, that that's what the whole book has been, in essence, that. So look at how he puts this, just to see him formulate this. This is on 743, 243 in the German. First full paragraph down, 743. The fundamental prejudice here, talking about, doesn't matter whether you're talking about skepticism, you're talking about the Eleatics, doesn't matter. Anyone who's taken over that Platonic conception of dialectics as a subjective art form to be used in support of another thesis. The fundamental prejudice here is that dialectic has only a negative result, that negation is destructive. A point about which more in a moment. First, regarding the said form in which dialectic usually makes its appearance, it is to be observed that according to that form, the dialectic and its result affect a subject matter which is previously assumed or also the subjective cognition of it, and declare either the latter or the subject matter to be null and void. So there's the destructive nature of the dialectic. Think of the skeptic. He's just mentioned Diogenes the cynic, right? Destroying everything by literally employing the dialectic to undermine everything. He says, on the contrary, though, no attention is given to the determinations which are exhibited in the subject matter as in a third thing and presupposes valid for themselves. Where did these come from? Where did this stuff come from, he's saying? Right? You can't just negate things. These things had to come from someplace. Well, it came out of negation. To have called attention to this uncritical procedure has been the infinite merit of the Kantian philosophy. And in so doing, to have given the impetus to the restoration of logic, like this, right? Transcendental logic is a stepping stone to speculative logic, like we're doing. And in so doing, to have given the impetus to the restoration of logic and dialectic understood as the examination of thought determinations in and for themselves. So we see this in Kant. This is what the dialectical portion of the first critique does, but ultimately that is destructive. This shows us why this far, no further, right? We can go only so far in our knowledge of things. We can't know things in themselves. Then he says, the subject matter as it is apart from thought and conceptualization is a picture representation or also a name. It is in the determinations of thought and of the concept that it is and what it is. In fact, therefore, everything rests on these determinations. They are the true subject matter and content of reason. Anything else that might be understood by subject matter and content in distinction from them, from this process, these determinations, thought determinations, has meaning only through them and in them. So this is this notion that I've given you the logical categories by which everything else is what it is. Then he walks you through negation. So if you want an account from Hegel of the fullness of negation, here you go. So take a look on page 744 over to 745. I'm going to walk us through here, so I appreciate your patience. He says, first full paragraph down, now this is the very standpoint indicated above. See where I'm at? From which a universal prius, considered in and for itself, proves to be the other of itself. Taken quite generally, this determination can be taken to mean that what is at first immediate is thereby posited as mediate, as reference to, as related to an other, or that the universal is posited as a particular. The second universal that has thereby arisen is thus the negative of that first, and in view of the subsequent developments, the first negative. From this negative side, the immediate has perished in the other, but the other is essentially not an empty negative, the nothing which is normally taken to be the result of dialectic, but is rather the other of the first. This is always Hegel's move. Negation doesn't negate absolutely. Negation negates specifically. The negation of the first. And he says, the negative of the immediate, it is therefore determined as the mediated. It contains as such the determination of the first in it. To negate it is to contain it. The first is thus essentially preserved and contained also in the other. Here's negation is sublation. Look down at the next paragraph. So what we have now, taken first or also immediately, is the mediated, also a simple determination. For the first has perished in it, and only the second is therefore at hand. So everything that we saw, we moved into, it became a new simple, a new beginning, from which we took off again, because it had negation built in it as well. So look what he says. Now, since the first is contained in the second, and the second is the truth of the first, it's the truth of language. This unity of the two can be expressed in the form of a proposition, in which the immediate is placed as the subject, but the mediated as its predicate. For example, the finite is infinite, one is many, the singular is the universe. We've been saying this repeatedly. Now he's giving you the general understanding about how that works, because negation kept the former in the latter, kept finitude in infinity, kept the singular in the universal, kept the one in the many. He then says on top of 745, first full paragraph down, 745. The second determination, the negative or mediated determination, is moreover at the same time the one that mediates. So it's not just the result of it, it's what produces this. That negation is really the active agent. At first it may be taken as a simple determination, but its truth is that it is a reference or relation, for it is the negative, but the negative of the positive. And it includes this positive within itself. It is the other, therefore not of a one to which is indifferent, in that case it would be not an other, nor a reference or relation. It is rather the other in itself, the other of an other. So here's negation, negation of negation. Hence it includes its own other within itself. It's both itself and not itself. It includes its own other within itself. It is itself and not itself. And is consequently the contradiction, the positive dialectic of itself. Now he immediately knows he's just violated the principle of non-contradiction, right? He's read Aristotle, he understands that, right? So look at what he says at the bottom of the paragraph. The firm principle that formal thinking lays down. It's like the tradition is going to balk at this. For itself here is that contradiction cannot be thought. Well, that. Something can't be itself and not be itself at the same time. Saying, we don't like that. That's the principle of non-contradiction. You are irrational, says Aristotle, if that's the principle of your thought. Hegel says, but in fact, the thought of contradiction is the essential moment of the concept, because it's negation negating itself. It is itself and not itself. Formal thought does in fact think it, only it at once looks away from it, and stating its principle, it only passes over from it into abstract negation, not determinate negation, but abstract negation. We can't think that, right? That's anathema, right? We can't think that. Contradiction. That's historical conventional mode of thinking. So Hegel's, he knows what he's doing. He's picking up the term dialectic and saying dialectic is not a subjective art that's been practiced for millennia. It's not equivalent to just that really destroys things. Either destroys the status of becoming so that you can say everything is one, as being, or it destroys everything and says there is nothing afterwards. Pure skepticism, cynicism. He says, no, it's productive. Okay, it's productive. We got that. But then if it's productive, it leads into a contradiction. Things are themselves, yes, but they negate themselves. Yes, so they're other than themselves at the same moment. So they're themselves and not themselves. They are in contradiction with themselves. Right. Okay, Hegel. Now you've gone and done it, right? Now you've gone and pulled a violation of Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction. He says, yeah, I got it, but even the people who say you can't think it reference it all the time and then run fleeing from it. I'm saying stay with it. Why? Because it's productive. Contradiction is a feature of the nature of reality, not just your brain, not just your mind, not just your thought. It produces things out of it. Look at what he says. Bottom paragraph on 745. This is one of those, where do you want Hegel to tell you what determinate negation is here? It's one of those passages, right? He says this. Now the negativity just considered, the one that renders everything in contradiction with itself, that negativity, which is a feature of reality and not a feature of our epistemic stance towards reality. Now, the negativity just considered constitutes the turning point of the movement of the concept. It is a simple point of the negative self-relation, negative self-reference relation here. The innermost source of all activity, of living and spiritual self-movement, in case you didn't get my point, right? Everything that is by virtue of this movement. It is the dialectical soul that everything true possesses and through which alone it is true. This is the passage I was reading out earlier. This is what makes everything true. It's what makes it be. It's what it is. For on this subjectivity alone rests the sublation of the opposition between concept and reality and the unity that is truth. The second negative at which we have arrived, the negative of the negative, negation of the negation, is this sublating of contradiction. And it too, just like contradiction, is not an act of external reflection. If you didn't get my claim earlier, this isn't something we do to things. This is something that things do of themselves. There's a wonderful moment in the introduction of the phenomenology, right? If you buy this or not, it's another matter. But there's a wonderful moment there where he says, look, here's what experience is. Experience is just this. Right? He just lays out what the formal nature of experience is. And he says, you know what our job is to do? Watch it. Observe it. Write a phenomenology of it. Because we don't need to make it do it. It does it already. We have to order it. It doesn't have that order to itself. That's why the phenomenological we of the phenomenology plays that essential role of organizing things from certainty to perception to understanding and so forth. Because experience on its everyday level is blooming, buzzing confusion. But it's doing this. It's doing this already. Well, there's an analogous, it's not the same thing. There's an analogous moment here where he's just literally saying, our job throughout all of this, the business of the science of logic explicator, is to just record what concepts do when you let concepts do what they do. His claim, preposterous as it is, right? Let's be clear. But his claim is that he didn't do any of this. All he did was let concepts unfold as they want to unfold, or as they do unfold. Negate themselves, contradict themselves, and produce something else out of that negation. And never once, huge claim, got to be wrong, huge claim is that never once did he stop in and say, and now we need to make this work this way. No. This is the way concepts unfold themselves. We're observers. So if you want to be strict about it, the methodology of philosophical science in general for Hegel is observation. Now, he doesn't mean by that empirical observation, right? So let's just be clear about that. We're not heading out to do our field studies. Philosophy, that's not what's happening. Although it's kind of field study, right, in logic. But it's not quite, empirical research, right? It's not empirical. So what do we mean by observation? We mean let concepts unfold as they unfold and mark their transitions. This is 740 pages worth of marking the unfolding of concepts, negation of themselves, into what's produced by those negations. So he says, the second negative at which we have arrived, the negative of the negative, is this sublating of contradiction. It too, just like contradiction, is not an act of external reflection. For it is, on the contrary, the innermost objective moment of the life of spirit by virtue of which a subject as a person is free. It's just, so that's him, flourishing there at the end, saying, this is how everything works. It's how we're free. It's how everything, it's how the personhood of the idea is free to generate itself out of itself. He then says, the self-relation of the negative is to be regarded as the second premise of the entire syllogism. If the terms analytic and synthetic are used as opposites, the first premise may be regarded as the analytic moment, for in it the immediate relates to its other immediately and therefore passes over, or rather has passed over into it through this connection, or through this relation, as already marked, is for this very reason also synthetic, for it is its other. Here's the synthetic moment, right? It's never something unto itself. It always is itself in and through its otherness. For it is its other that it passes over into. The second premise considered here may be defined as synthetic because it is the connection, the relation of the differentiated as differentiated to that from which it is differentiated. Just as the first premise is the moment of universality and communication, so is the second determined by singularity, a singularity which in referring or relating to the other is at first exclusive for itself and different. The negative appears as the mediating factor, it's the middle term, because it holds itself in the immediate of which it is the negation within it. And so far as these two determinations are taken as relating to each other externally in some relation or other, the negative is only the formal mediating factor. But as absolute negativity, the negative moment of absolute mediation is the unity, which is subjectivity and so on. So he then can say, in this moment of sublation of this contradiction, we've reached a new determination, a new immediacy, is about to say in the next, a restoration of the first immediacy, but not quite. I mean, what he's about to say after he finishes this discussion of methodology, he's going to say, and with the end of the logic, we have returned to being. He'll say, crap, we got to do the whole thing over again? I mean, you're literally telling me we got to go back to the beginning and start with being. Being's empty, vacuous. Oh, that's nothing. Oh, is it? Repetition like that? No. Hegel says, now we've reached being again, but he calls it there, very importantly, one little word, fulfilled being. What does that mean? Being that has determination now. Didn't have determination on the first time through. Right? It was vacuous and indeterminate. That's why it was nothing. But now we're back to being as what? Fully, completely determinate. At least in its logical determination. So he says, next paragraph down, in this turning point of the method, everybody see where we're at? In this turning point of the method, this is 746, right in the middle of the page, 247 in the German. In this turning point of the method, the course of cognition returns at the same time back into itself. So our thinking about this and also the way in which things operate are parallel to one another. Right? We're following it along. We're following the lead of ontological negativity. This negativity is, as self-sublating contradiction, the restoration of the first immediacy of simple universality. For the other of the other, the negative is immediately the positive, the identical, the universal. It's a wonderful toss-off line. In the whole course, if one and all cares to count, if you're tracking this through, if you're going to insist that there's, what's first, what's second, and so forth, he says, if one at all cares to count, this second immediate is third. Second immediacy is third. How so? To the first immediate and the mediated. So the first immediacy, the beginning with which we began, then it others itself. And now we've got a second immediacy, but it's really the third because the way from one to the other was absolute negativity. Here's the second. So now we've met. But it is also the third to the first, or formal negative, and to the absolute negativity, or second negative. Now, insofar as that first negative is already the second term, the term counted as third can also be counted as fourth. So here's, this account of determinate negation really gets you out of the triadic understanding, right? That still is, a lot of people have, right? That we start with one thing, we get another thing, then we get a third thing, and we're happy, we're fine. Hegel's saying, no, you've got more than that. Look at what he says. The term counted as third can also be counted as fourth, and instead of a triplicity, which, by the way, Kant loved, Kant says it in the first critique, I love triplicity. Hegel's saying, instead of a triplicity, the abstract form may also be taken to be a quadruplicity. In this way, the negative or the difference is counted as a duality, if you care to count. If you're going to try to put it in those kind of formal constraints, if you're going to try to put determinate negation into stages and say the first stage, the second stage, and third stage, well, the third stage turns out to be the second stage, but also the fourth stage. So it's not just a triplicity, it's also a quadruplicity. So what are you going to do with that? You're not going to count. Well, Hegel, you got all these threes all over this whole book. You got triplicity all over the place. Well, actually, he does and he doesn't, because the end of one is the beginning of another. So what looks like a third is really the beginning of. So it's really, this is what he's talking about, right? What looks like it's the third is actually the second and turns out to be the first of the next. So this whole numbering thing, this is what he's ranting about. The whole numbering thing is what's mistaken here. That's the external consideration of the movement of the concept. So then he says this. Take a look on page 747. Right in the middle of the page. It's 248 in the German. Now, on closer examination, so here's, that little phrase there means if we're going to get serious about this and not count, if we're going to be serious about this, so closer examination. The third is the immediate. So the third is now a new immediacy. It's like when we looked at each one of those movements, we realized, wait a minute, the last one is really the first one again. It's where we start from. So the third is really the first of the new analysis. Third is the immediate, but the immediate now through sublation of mediation. So it's an engendered, a produced immediate. The simple through the sublating of difference, the positive through the sublating of the negative. It is the concept that has realized itself through its otherness, and through the sublating of this reality has rejoined itself and has restored its absolute reality, its simple self-relation. This result is therefore the truth. What is? The result is that it's just as much immediacy as mediation, he says, though these forms of judgment, that the third is immediacy and mediation, or that is the unity of two, are not capable of grasping it, for it is not a dormant third, but exactly like this unity, self-mediating movement and activity. Right? The problem is that whenever you try to stage it, whenever you try to mark out the various stages and number them, you miss the movement. So he says this to conclude. Just as that with which we began was the universal, so the result is the singular. Universality particularizes itself in a singularity. There we are. So particularization is determinate negation. It's how we generate, how determination is generated. Just as that with which we began was the universal, so the result is the singular, the concrete, the subject. What the former is in itself, the latter is now equally for itself. So it is a movement from in itself to for itself, but it's not where the in itself had bound up in it all this for itself waiting to escape. That'd be the superfluidity. It's where the for itself arises out of the determination, the determinate negation that arises out of and gives determination to the in itself. The universal is posited as in the subject. The two first moments of triplicity are abstract, untrue moments that are dialectical for that very reason. And through this, their negativity make themselves into the subject. For us, at first, the concept itself is both the universal that exists in itself and the negative that exists for itself. And also the third term that exists in and for itself. So for us, we separate things out. We have the universal, we have the particular, we have the singular. He says, and also the third term that exists in and for itself, the universal that runs through all the moments of the syllogism. But this third is the conclusion in which the concept mediates itself with itself through its negativity and is thereby posited for itself as the universal in an identity of its moments. That's not something we did. It's something we recognized, we observed. It's something that the concept, being, did itself. Then, as best I can tell, right, can't remember if this is in the room or not. Yeah. So there is no three. Right? I don't know if you noticed that. Right? There's no three. There's a one, right? There's a one back here at on 738. The one is the beginning, right? Then he gives you two. That's on the bottom of 740. We've still been in that, right? Talking about it. And he's just ranted against trying to number things. So maybe I'm wrong to start introducing a number system here where he's not got one. But I think you probably should put 3 down 4. It's not in the German either. So it's not a mistake in the translation. It really is just how he set up this final chapter. But that bottom paragraph on 747, 248 in the German, it begins, now this result as the whole that is redrawn into itself and identical with itself has given itself again the form of immediacy. That's him transitioning to the last topic he wants to talk about. So I think that's 3. That's where 3 starts, if you're going to number them. If you're into triplicity. He says, consequently, it is now itself all that the starting point has determined itself to be. A simple self-relation, it is a universal, and in this universal, the negativity that constitutes dialectic and mediation has likewise withdrawn into simple determinants, which can again be a beginning. And he says, what if you were to follow this kind of, just observe the development of the concept in this work of negativity out, where would it lead to? Where would it take you? He says this. This is 748. It's right at where 249, the mark for 249 is at. On the new foundation that the result is now constituted as a subject matter. Everybody see where I'm at? He writes this. On the new foundation, so let's just say we've moved from being now to becoming. We'll just take that as an example of this method in operation. We're now at becoming. On the new foundation that the result is now constituted as a subject matter. So what is becoming? Becoming just is existence. Remember that move, right? Becoming is not something that settles into existence. It just is existence. So the third is really the first beginning of the other. The difference concerns solely the status of the foundation as such. Although it is certainly still a foundation, its immediacy is only form, since it's that as well, since it was a result as well, came to be out of something else. Hence, its determinateness as content is no longer something merely taken up, but is deduced and proved. So here's the first moment in the logic where Hegel has talked about we are carrying out deductions and proving things by virtue of this ontological observation analysis. Then look at what he says next. What do you get out of this? It is here that the content of cognition first enters as such into the circle of consideration, because as deduced, it now belongs to the method. The method itself expands with this moment into a system. So if you think about this, right, one way of talking about this is very linearly, right? We move from being to nothing to becoming. Becoming is where we start with existence, and then we move from that, and we go from there, and that takes us to the next step, and the next step, and the next step on from there. So it's very linear in that progression. And you would have a line of argumentation, a flow of argumentation from one to the next. But Hegel's saying, well, that's not just an account of the ontological structure of the nature of reality, that being entails nothing, entails becoming, entails existence, and so forth. But it's also demonstrative. It's proving, it's establishing those concepts in relationship to one another. Existence is that which follows from, it's the result of becoming, as it's been shown to be the result of being, and so on and so forth from there on out. But what does that lead you to? He says it leads you to these concepts are now deduced and proved, and that means they become a system. Now look, everybody in this period knows what a system is. Right? It's what genuine philosophical knowledge, said Kant, aspires to. And Kant defined it this way. It's the accumulation of knowledge under the idea. It's the accumulation, the putting together of knowledge, so that it's not an aggregate. It's the accumulation of knowledge under the principle of the idea itself. And Kant never created this system, right? There is no system of critical metaphysics, which, of course, Kant always aspired to. It's why all those books after the critiques are called Metaphysics of Nature and Metaphysics of Morals, all that kind of stuff. It's what he's trying to accomplish. So he was striving after such a system. That's pretty clear if you read all the books. But everyone else said, yeah, but you're never going to get a system. We've been here before. You're never going to get a system when you've broken things into dualisms. You can't put them back together in a systematic fashion. You can't show how one thing, necessarily entails another under the idea. Well, we've just shown that we got to the idea, and we've shown how all knowledge is deduced, proved under it, by it. So we've now reached the status in which we can have a genuine system. So he says on the next page, on 749 now, just back up. Yeah. So look at 749, right where the mark is for 250. But the very indeterminacy that these logical beginnings have as their sole content. Yeah. So he's just reminding you, right? Negativity is built into all immediacy. So negativity is not something that you have to foist on to anything. It's already there. Let it do its work. That's our job, to observe the work of negativity, the negative and positive work of negativity. Let's put it that way. But the very indeterminacy that these logical beginnings have as their sole content is what constitutes their determinateness. Here, their lack of determinacy is what determines them as such. This determinateness consists in their negativity as sublative mediation. This determinateness, the particularity of this negativity gives a particularity also to their indeterminacy, and is by virtue of it that being, essence, and universality are differentiated. So you can go back and compare the logic of being to the logic of essence to the logic of universality. Now, the determinants that accrues to them when taken for themselves is their immediate determinateness. And this is just as immediate as that of any content, and in need, therefore, of derivation. For the method is a matter of indifference whether the determinateness is taken as determinateness of form, of content. Doesn't matter. We can derive things from it. That it gives itself a determination by the first of its results does not mean that in fact it is thereby set on a new footing. It remains neither more nor less formal than before. For since the method is the absolute form, the concept that knows itself and everything as concept, there is no content that would stand out over against it and determine it as a one-sided external form. There is no externality. The concept is everything. There's nothing outside it. Hence, he says, just as the lack of content of the said beginnings does not make them absolute beginnings, so too it is not the content that would as such lead the method into the infinite progress forwards or backwards, the infinite spurious backwards and forwards. In one respect, the determinants that the method generates for itself in its results is the moment through which it is self-mediation and converts the immediate into a mediated beginning. The immediate into a mediated beginning. But conversely, it is through that determinants that this mediation of the method runs its course. It goes through a content as through a seeming other of itself back to its beginning in such a way that it does not merely restore that beginning, albeit as determinate, but that the result is equally the sublated determinateness, and hence also the restoration of the first immediacy in which it began. This it accomplishes as a system of totality. Now, I don't know about you, but what he just described is we start off from something immediate. It bears within it negativity, so it others itself, and it others itself to give itself determination until eventually it comes back to itself. But it doesn't come back to itself as it was at the beginning. It's now a mediated immediacy. It's sublated immediacy. And that's what he calls a system. So a system is not for him closed back upon itself like a circle standardly would be thought. That we go back to where we started from. We do go back to where we started from, but not in the same sense. We're about to go back to being, but not in its vacuous indeterminacy, but in its fulfilledness. He says, we now have to consider it in this determination. He says, we're now working with, it's top of 750, this development of concepts into one another that eventually comes back to themselves. They refer back to the beginning, but that's not a beginning that is the same as that from which we left. That's why he can say that this is an enrichment and an expansion. It's a return, but it's also a moving beyond. He then says this. So he knows this sounds like a circle, but it's not a circle. So he says these things as I read. Bottom paragraph on 750, it is in this manner that each step of the advance, it says this, 750, 251 in the German. It is in this manner that each step of the advance in the process of further determination, while getting away from the indeterminate beginning, is also a getting back closer to it. So it does come back to it, right? It does come back to it. Being is not left behind in the ash heap. We come back to being. We come back to essence. We come back to all those things. But we don't come back to them in the same way. We come back to them in a different way. That what may at first appear to be different, the retrogressive grounding of the beginning and the progressive further determination of it, run into one another and are the same. The method which thus coils in a circle cannot, however, anticipate in a temporal development that the beginning is as such already something derived. It's not already there. It's not already superfluid, ready to overwhelm itself. Sufficient for an immediate beginning is that it be a simple universality. That's enough. So then he continues on with this question about the circle. 252 now in the German, 751 at the bottom of the page. By virtue of the nature of the method just indicated, the science presents itself as a circle that winds around itself, where the mediation winds the end back to the beginning, which is the simple ground. It's, as he says now, a circle of circles. There's an image, right? But how to think it? Is it a circle with a bunch of circles in it? Or is it a circle that circles out? Is it a circle that comes back to itself, but then when it comes back to itself, it moves again? It's elliptical? Is that what's going on? For each single member ensouled by the method is reflected into itself, so that in returning to the beginning, returning back to the beginning, so coming back to the first, it is at the same time the beginning of a new member, so it goes out again. So does it ever really come back to the beginning, strictly speaking? Sounds like not. Fragments of this chain are the single sciences, each of which has a before and an after, or more accurately said, has in possession only the before and its conclusion points to its after. So there's the special sciences, right? There is the science of nature, the science of the philosophical science of nature, philosophical science of spirit. But how does that work? I don't exactly know from what he says there. He uses the same image, a circle of circles, in the encyclopedia to talk about how the entirety of the encyclopedia relates to itself, right? So now you can think about each one of the sciences, the science of nature, science of spirit, is a circle, and it's, the science of logic is a circle, so they're a circle of circles. But then he's talking about the science of logic as itself a system that circles back to its beginning, being, but then doesn't quite circle back to it. He says, let me deal with that next week, because it takes too much to get there. He says here that it comes back to its beginning in being, but it doesn't come back to its beginning as it did the first. It repeats it, but doesn't repeat it like it was the first time. So I think that means that we have to think circle as circulation. A lot of times when he talks about this, he'll say Kreislauf, right? Not just Kreis, not just circle, but Kreislauf is flow, circulation. And I think the circle of circles is best read as a circle that comes back on itself, but doesn't actually touch its beginning again. It circles out again, circles out again. Now, you will rightly say to me, people have, that what I just described is spurious infinity. So let's be clear. There is that issue. If it doesn't close back on itself, doesn't it just issue out into a beyond and another beyond and another beyond? Is that not spurious infinity? I'm going to say it's not, but trying to work through that, the text doesn't seem to be helpful. But maybe that's my problem, not the text. Enough. Let's see if we're good. So here's what I want to talk about for next week. I'll take questions about what we just talked about, if you have those. Let me lay out at least the things I want us to talk about for next week. And then we'll look at the master argument of the logic as a whole. I want to talk about the because the next paragraph on 752 is famous for introducing the discussion about nature and the transition to nature. So we need to talk about the relationship between logic and nature. What does he mean by the absolute idea in its self-externality, which is how he defines nature. And that, for him, is space, time, motion, and matter. So we'll be back to these last few paragraphs of the absolute idea chapter to talk about those next week. And we'll also talk about another matter, which is really in the preface to the second edition, which is the relationship that's been kind of percolating underneath. We talked about it more last quarter, not so much this quarter, but I want to come back and talk about it. And I want to talk about it in terms of the critiques that we've talked about. To begin with, the critique from the ineffable and the critique from the immemorial. Come back and talk about those. And that's the question of what's the relationship between logic and language? Logic and language. How can we say these things? What kind of language allows for this strange way of speaking about things? So what are the requirements for a speculative theory of language or a speculative language? A systematic kind of language itself. So we'll talk more about those. Obviously, Hegel's been using concepts all over the place, right? He's been using ones that we know from the tradition. He constantly says, I'm going to take this, but I'm not going to use it in a conventional standard way. So he's telling you, I know it has baggage. I know it comes with historicity. I know it comes with tradition built into it already, but I want to get rid of all. And you want to say, I don't think you can. I mean, where do you get off? Where do you think you can just slough off all that wonderful history? You can, Gadamer's rolling over in his grave every time we say something like that. You say, tradition, light cloak, throw it off. No. It deeply, densely determines, certainly shapes and conditions the world in which we live and how we think about it. So, Hegel naive about that? Does he think we can just get rid of this? So Hegel's going to claim, just in a very brief sentence, so it's not an elaborated theory there. I'm going to elaborate a theory out of it, but there's not an elaborate theory there, where he says, look, the forms of thought are contained in human language. These forms of thought are contained in human language. So he's acknowledging, right, the kind of metacritical point that Hamann and others made, which is to say, you can't think without language. He'll go, yep, you're exactly right. This is not possible without human language already. And human language comes with its baggage, right? It comes with things that are expressible, things that are not expressible, things that are beyond the constraints of language itself, the ineffable, things that it comes also with baggage, history, associations that it's had over time. It comes with historicity. It comes with the immemorial. So Hegel's well aware of that. Right? And he wants to say, and yet, the thought forms are contained there, but they're not trapped. And that means he has to have some conception of language that doesn't fall, let me put it this way, that's not fully and completely exhausted by trying to speak about things. What else do we use language for to speak about things? It's not fully exhausted by that. And it's not fully exhausted by the fact that it's associated with other things. I mean, if you ask Metacritics, they will say, like Hamann, he will say, language is wonderful because it's got all these wonderful associations you can make out of it. And he loved to play with them. Hamann was fantastic at being able to play with the associations you can get out of language. He did all sorts of stuff with them. It's beautiful, wonderful, poetic, and otherwise. And Hegel wants to say, yeah, I see you doing that. I see that that's doable. I see that that's possible. But I also think that language is not just that, or not only that. And other people will say, well, language is what we're trying to say about things. And there may be some things that are beyond linguistic expressibility, the ineffable. We want to try to say things about it, but all we can say is fragments. Schlegel says that. Novalis says that. Those of you who are in the Benjamin class, things like that as well. All we can speak is in fragments. Benjamin doesn't want to be a romantic, but he is. Sorry. So it's always aspiring to something beyond. Okay? And Hegel wants to say, I see you're doing that with language. Language can do that as well. But that doesn't exhaust what language, well, what else is language? And Hegel's going to make the claim, this is the crazy claim we're going to look at. We need one more crazy claim on the table. Here's the crazy claim we're going to look at next week. Is that language does not have to be solely referential. Referentiality of language, its representational character, that it's about things, is why it has a history. It's why it's trying to express the ineffable, but the ineffable is beyond it. And Hegel says, language definitely has a representational function. Absolutely does. You couldn't do what I'm doing right now, speaking to you about things, if I wasn't speaking to you, about things. So it's representational. Absolutely. But it's not representational. It's not exhausted by its representationality. It's not exhausted by its referentiality. There's something more to language than just that, and we're missing it when we only see it as representational and only in representational alone. What else is it? Well, we'll talk more about that next week. But arguably, that's what makes possible the logic, is that this language is not representational. It's not about something that exists outside it. It is about itself. It's about the flow from one concept to the next. Of course, that is the nature of reality itself. But it's not speaking about reality. It's laying out the very structure of reality itself. That's what the non-representational nature of language, speculative language, is. We'll talk more about that next week. Ken, do you have a question?
So I apologize for this being relatively poorly formatted, and I don't know if I'm remembering this correctly,
right.
But Hegel will critique Aristotle on the grounds of his employing of languages, that it manifests something about phenomenal reality to us, that it's a conduit into being in some regard.
Yeah.
Would it be fair enough to say that the difference among the many differences, is that Hegel doesn't stop as being purely representational in terms of what language should do as it manifests in thought forms, and on his reading, Aristotle is only giving you that language is only representational of being?
Yeah. So I think that's exactly right. I think that when Hegel goes and critiques Aristotle or anyone else about their usage of language, notice what he always does. He always starts off by saying something like the following. So he did a review of when Hamann's collected works came out, he did a review of it. And he talks about Hamann's work in roughly these terms. He'll say, look, you can do what Hamann was doing by talking about things. And you can say, well, because you're talking about things, you also accumulate the various things that are associated with that. And so you get the baggage of a history and tradition, what we call historicity of it. You get all that sort of stuff associated with it. Absolutely that. And then you can also talk about, because you're talking about things as representation, you can talk about things. You're also talking about things that exceed it, that can go beyond it, that are not linguistically expressible. That are ineffable. He said, you can do that as well. I get those. He's acknowledging that language can be used that way. But all that's premised on saying that language is fundamentally and ultimately only representational. His point is that is there, so you have those issues. But you don't have those issues if you're seeing that language is not just representation. Sure, it does that as a representational function, but it's not just representation. And this is one of the weird moments in Hegel's account where he wants to say, you know what's really crucial to language? Mechanical memory, where you completely divorced any kind of content that would be represented from the terms you're just memorizing. That you're just holding to. Why? Because you just hold them together. The content doesn't matter. What they're representing, what they're about, their representationality, meaningless at that point. You're just uttering one thing after another thing after another thing. That's mechanical rote memorization. And Hegel puts that at the pinnacle, right before you get to thought, in Hegel's account of epistemology, epistemic subject. Right before you get to thought, you have to go through language, and you have to go through the language in terms of mechanical memorization. This is in the philosophy of spirit. And when he's saying that, he's saying, look, that means that all of that has been, what mechanical memory is it's ripped out all the representational function of language. It's completely devoid of that. And all it is just the connections of one term to another term to another term. Well, what does the connecting? Well, Hegel says there in his account of that discussion of mechanical memory that the mind holds those things all together. It bonds them together in accordance with its own logic. This logic. So as I read that, that's Hegel saying terms can be bound together to represent reality. This bottle is clear. Terms being joined together to represent reality. But they can also be abstracted from that. You can just put clear and bottle and other terms just together and associate them together without having any intentional aboutness about them at all. Because you can do that, you can have a different grammar operative than the grammar of predication. Predication is always about ascribing things to things. Here you would have a grammar that connects things, one concept to another concept to another concept. What would be that grammar? I'm not going to surprise you. It's determinate negation. It's a generative grammar, to use Chomsky's language, not Hegel's. Hegel wasn't Chomsky before Chomsky. There is this notion of generative grammar that I think you can see already in Hegel. It's what makes possible a speculative language. And if you start thinking that way about this language, think about it. Most basically, the first step is to say, well, this language is not talking about something that's external to it. It's really just talking about how one concept flows into the other. And of course, this is the nature of reality as well, but it's not extrinsic to reality. Right? So it's the way reality flows into another concept, it flows into another determination, flows into another determination. That would be the non-representational speculative language that we're employing here to speak about the thought forms. And those would not fall prey to the baggage of history, the contamination, to put it in Derridian language, nor the ineffability of aspiring to speak after something that's external to it, because there's nothing external to it. Speculative language itself. More about that next week. But that's at least the rudiments of what I think is underlying that statement that he makes in 1831, having now written that account of, because there's markers in that passage that's clearly referring back to his own account of the philosophy of spirit and its account of language, right? So I'll point those out to you when we go through it. So that's kind of, but he owes us an account of how is it linguistically possible to do what you're doing. And I think that's what that passage provides at least some evidence for. Does that help with that?
No, it is helpful. I'm sure I'll have more to say next week.
Absolutely.
I get going.
Absolutely, please, yeah. We'll come back to it. Other comments, questions? So we're going to look at logic and nature. We're going to look at logic and language, right, next week.
Where is his account on Hamas?
I'm sorry?
Where is Hegel's account on?
It's in a review that he wrote. He wrote in 1820 something or other. I'm not remember the exact year. It's 1820. It's when the second volume of Haman's work came out. He wrote a review of it. It's a fairly lengthy review. It's in the. I mean, this doesn't help you because I'm not telling you which volume. It's in the critical edition, obviously. But I'll get you the reference. It's been translated, and I can get you the reference to the translation as well. Yeah. Yeah. You'll be disappointed by it. Let me caution you, right? Because he does a lot of discussing of Haman's life, right? So a large part of of the review is this character made his character part of his own work, right? And so let's talk about him. So he spends a lot of it doing that.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it's a wonderful, fascinating piece. It's one of the few times where you'll see a rationalist critical philosopher engaging with the metacritical challenging of their very project. And that's what Hegel's doing at the point. He clearly knew the Metacritique of the Purism of Reason, that little piece that Hamann had written and had been circulated around. That gets published in this volume, right? So he talks about it there, kind of offhandedly. But he also goes through this other stuff, and you see there, I think, fairly clearly that he's challenging the conception of language as being reducible merely to representational language. All right, let's take a look at this then, see if this is helpful. We've seen this several times, this first part. So we did this all last quarter, so nothing new to us here. To be is to be qualitative and quantitatively determined. That is, to be is it wants to be real, to be existent as discrete, to be is to be an entity. And we see how all that entailed ultimately actuality is the unity of essence and concrete existence. There's the objective logic laid out in premise conclusion form. I don't claim it to be definitive. I just claim it to hopefully be helpful to remember, what steps are crucial along the way. And then what I'm trying to point out here is the, crucial transition pivot points in the logic itself. So here's the doctrine of the concept, just to remind you of where we've been this quarter. To be actual is to be an entity and thoroughgoing necessary causal reciprocity with all entities. So that's the conclusion of the doctrine of the objective logic. The reciprocal causality of all entities is brought about by a process of manifestation whose form is absolute necessity and whose content is becoming itself by becoming other, self-determination. The movement of the concept, necessity is elevated to freedom. So again, that's the end of the objective logic. Now, the structure of the movement of the concept, so now we move into the subjective logic straightforward, is the structure of the disjunctive syllogism, universality, genus particularizing itself, species, and thereby becoming singular. The structure of the disjunctive syllogism is the structure of objectivity, and therefore objectivity, actuality now, is not just a relation. The objective logic has shown us it was a relation, but it's not just a relation, but more fundamentally a mechanical, chemical, and ultimately teleological process. The concept qua purpose, then, teleological, must be intrinsic to objectivity, and thus it is an impulse to differentiate and sublate that in the logical sense as life, cognitive and volitional striving, and finally the personhood that forms reality within and out of itself. Remember, that's one of the ways in which Hegel describes what the logic is all about, how it forms from within itself and out of itself reality. Then here's the conclusion, as I read it a little bit ago. The concept is all, and its movement is the universal absolute activity, the self-determining and self-realizing movement. I mean, it's kind of a anticlimactic ending to the book, right? To hear that this is what has been shown, but that's not nothing. That is, like he says, alles, everything. Everything is that. Not in all of its fullness, not in all its determinacy, right? But it is that, nothing else and other than. Now, if that's right, big if, we'll come back and talk more about if that's right next week, because we'll talk about the critiques again of Hegel's project. I do think it's worth walking out of here today thinking about two things at least. I hope I provoke you to think about more than just these two things, but two things at least. One of which is, my God, what a massive rationalist Hegel is. That panlogicism thing got a lot to it. Because Hegel has just literally said, there's nothing that's outside the concept. Everything that is the concept. He means that, right? The concept is all. It's not like, it's really important. You should know about the concept too. It's the only thing that's important. It's the only thing that ultimately is and makes everything is what it is in its truth. It's the business of philosophy to know it and only it. So he's a massive rationalist in that sense. There's really nothing that seems to escape the purview of the concept. And if that's right, then it looks like he's a massive rationalist. So maybe that panlogicism criticism emanating out of Schelling, not so quickly dismissed. I mean, he didn't get it wrong. Schelling didn't get it wrong. The ambition of Hegel is massive. The Science of Logic is not a text that says, here's some reflections on what it would be to know the world logically. It is, here's what the world is. And it's logical. not to be known logically. It is logical. The concept is everything. You can know the rules by which the world operates and generates everything that's in it. They're in this book. That's a pretty massive claim. So I'd like to talk more about the panlogicism question next week, because certainly coming out of that crazy argument, the core argument, the master argument of the logic, we would want to say, that seems like an overreach, maybe. A little hubristic, body hubristic. Doesn't he know his place in the world? Doesn't he know what finite minds can and can't know? Absolute knowing that absolute? That's the claim. So that's the first thing I'd like to talk about. The second thing I'd like to talk about is those critiques about, well, that panlogicism has got to be reconsidered in terms of what it can't say, the ineffable, and what it can't actually account for, but that makes it possible, the immemorial. So we'll come back and talk about those criticisms of the panlogistic nature of Hegel's work itself in the science of logic in particular. And we'll want to ask ourselves, right? Are those criticisms right? Or do they assume things that Hegel's undermined? Like, subject-object dichotomy, that differentiation is only negative and negative is only destructive, that there's something that exists. What would that even mean? Outside the concept? Just think about this for a moment. When Adorno says that there's something that remains beyond the concept, there's something that won't go into, that's the way he puts it, go into the concept. He's not that far different than Kierkegaard saying, I love this system except there's no place for me in it. Because the existential I doesn't exist in there. But to Hegel, those statements literally make no sense. Where is this place that is beyond the concept? I mean, I don't just think that, the concept is everything. I tried to show it. And if I'm right, big if, right? I could be wrong. But if I'm right, then there is nothing outside the concept. So I know we're all excited about negative dialectics because it's outside the concept, and something's non-rational stands outside the concept. But Hegel says, I just don't know what. I don't even know how that makes any sense. Where's that being spoken from? Same thing for Kierkegaard. Where's this individuality outside of the movement of universality particularizing itself into singularity and into individuality? Well, I stand outside of all that, right? You're a bare individual. You're a this. But that's an abstraction from that process. That process makes that possible for you to be that. So how does it stand outside it when it's made possible by these? So Hegel will think these criticisms just don't. They presume things, they have presuppositions that Hegel thinks you're not entitled to, and that his own work has undermined in a lot of ways. This is the frustration, right? Where do you get a critical perspective on Hegel? Because he's taken away the very standpoints from which you can make such criticisms of him. Well, then the alternative is to fall into the black hole known as Hegel. And we don't really want to do that because we think, at the intuitive level, Schelling, as crazy as he was, had something going when he said maybe existence is outside the concept. Maybe our mythologies and our religions tell us and give us an intuitive access to something that's outside the concept in the way that it operates. Outside of reason, the way that it operates. Now Hegel will say, fine, go be a mystic. That's what that means for him, right? I don't want to make this more pleasant than it is for him. Go be a mystic. You're not doing philosophy anymore. Go be a mystic. But, that's not a bad thing. Right? To be a mystic, it just means you're not doing philosophy, right? On Hegel's terms. So notice that's where it seems to me the struggle is waged on both sides and all the sides that you're dealing with. So I want us to come back next week and we'll look at some things in the text and talk about those a bit. I'll give you my little speculative language crap, and we'll talk about the ineffable and the immemorial critiques. But I'd like for us to come back and talk about the 20 weeks we've spent looking at a massive rationalist panlogistic text and see if it's got any merit or not. Yeah. All right. Enough for this week. Thank you.